You have been told, time and time again, to put leftover coffee grounds directly on top of your soil. It is presented as the ultimate free fertilizer, organic and readily available in almost every household. It looks beautiful, creating a rich, dark, visually pleasing mulch that makes the garden look professionally tended and highly cared for. The dark color makes the dirt look healthy and fertile, tricking our eyes into believing we have improved the plot. But watch very closely what happens when you attempt to water a potted plant that has had a solid layer of coffee grounds sitting undisturbed on its surface for 3 weeks. The water runs off the dark surface exactly like it hit a solid plastic lid. It splashes aggressively over the sides, pools up heavily around the very edges of the rim, and never actually penetrates the dirt below. This is the internet's absolute favorite free garden hack, and it is quietly, efficiently, and relentlessly starving your beloved plants of the very water you're desperately trying to give them during the intense heat of the summer. The advice, on its face, sounds logical and highly environmentally responsible. Coffee grounds are purely organic, they break down over time, they contain high levels of nitrogen, and, best of all, they are free. So, we carefully save the paper filters every morning. We proudly dump the wet, fragrant clumps directly onto the surface of our expensive pots and raised garden beds, and we smooth them out into a neat, aesthetically pleasing dark layer. We think we are doing the soil a favor. But there is a fundamental physical difference between mechanically mixing an organic material deep into the soil matrix and leaving it fully exposed to the open air on the surface. When you spread fine coffee grounds on top of the ground, you are not feeding your soil. You are physically paving it with an impermeable, impenetrable shield that blocks out the rain. To truly understand why the water is bouncing off the surface of your pots and refusing to enter the soil, we have to look very closely at the microscopic physical mechanics of the coffee particle itself. The physics here is settled. The behavior of any particulate layer in a garden is determined primarily by its exact grain size and its chemical coating. Coffee grounds are extremely fine particulates, almost mimicking the physical texture of silt or fine sand. When they are freshly brewed and fully saturated with boiling water, they stick together easily in a heavy, cohesive clump. But when they are left exposed on the surface of the soil, subjected to the baking sun, the wind, and the dry ambient air, they begin to dehydrate rapidly. As the internal moisture evaporates away into the atmosphere, the fine particles contract forcefully and lock tightly against one another. The microscopic spaces between the individual grains shrink down to almost nothing, creating a dense, highly compacted physical barrier that closely mimics the structural behavior of hard, baked clay. But physical compaction is only half of the mechanical problem. The real underlying issue is severe, uncompromising hydrophobic repulsion caused by residual lipids. Coffee beans naturally contain significant amounts of organic oils and complex fats locked deep within their cellular structure. When the raw beans are roasted at high temperatures and then finely ground for your coffee maker, these natural oils are aggressively released. They physically coat the exterior surface of every single tiny particle with a greasy film. While the morning brewing process successfully extracts the water-soluble compounds, the delicate acids, and the caffeine you want for your drink, a thin, stubborn film of heavy residual oil remains heavily concentrated on the spent grounds that you throw in the bucket. Water cannot wash these oils away. When this oily, fine particulate layer dries out under the intense heat of the sun, it undergoes a radical physical phase change. It becomes intensely, aggressively hydrophobic. It actively repels liquid water molecules on contact. The surface tension of the water you pour from your watering can physically cannot break through the microscopic, oily shield that is coating the tightly compacted coffee layer. Instead of soaking evenly into the ground via normal capillary action, the water immediately beads up into tiny spheres. The cohesive forces of the water keep it tightly grouped in heavy droplets that roll rapidly across the surface of the crust, seeking the lowest point of gravity, usually spilling directly over the plastic edge of the pot or channeling violently down the inside walls of the container, bypassing the actual dirt underneath. The severity of this hydrophobic barrier depends directly on the physical thickness of the application. The physical line between a harmless, beneficial dusting of organic matter and an impermeable crust is dangerously thin. We must look at this millimeter by millimeter to fully grasp the devastating threat it poses to soil hydrology and root health. If you scatter a very light, almost invisible dusting of coffee grounds randomly across the surface, say less than 1 single millimeter in thickness, the physical matrix of the underlying potting soil is still largely exposed to the air. The water droplets can easily find physical paths around the scattered individual coffee particles and successfully enter the hydrophilic soil pores below. At this negligible thickness, the grounds break down safely and integrate into the biological system without disrupting the flow of moisture. But the exact moment the coffee grounds are applied thickly enough to form a continuous, unbroken layer, even one as thin as 3 to 5 millimeters, the physical mechanics of the surface change in an irreversible way. The tiny particles geometrically interlock. The oily residues physically overlap, creating a unified, unbroken hydrophobic shield across the entire surface area of the pot. Once this extremely thin crust sets and dries in the sun, it acts mechanically like a sheet of stretched plastic wrap or a tightly shingled roof blocking out a storm. If you increase that thickness to 10 or 15 millimeters, the compaction becomes so severe that the crust can actually be lifted off the soil in a single, rigid, dry disc, almost like a piece of hardened pottery. You can test this severe hydrophobicity yourself in your own garden today. Take a dry, compacted layer of coffee grounds that has been sitting in the sun and gently pour a single tablespoon of water directly onto the exact center of it. The water will sit on top of the crust indefinitely, vibrating like liquid mercury. It will slowly evaporate back into the ambient air over the course of the afternoon, rather than draining a single millimeter downward into the soil. The physical resistance of the overlapped oils is so immensely strong that the water cannot pull itself into the dry, desperately empty soil pores below, no matter how long it sits there. This physical reality means that during a light afternoon rain, or when you quickly water your containers with a garden hose, the moisture never actually reaches the root zone. You stand there thinking you watered your garden, but the soil sitting just 1 centimeter below that dark, rich-looking coffee crust is bone dry. By applying a solid layer of fine grounds, you have physically disconnected the plant from its only available water supply. If you're starting to see how physical surface layers dictate water movement in your garden, take a moment to subscribe. In the next video, we will explore the air between the grains and how microscopic pore space determines whether a plant thrives or suffocates. The object itself is not the enemy here. Coffee grounds are a valuable biological resource that belong in your garden ecosystem. The betrayal comes from how we are commonly told to apply them by well-meaning but mechanically uneducated sources. To fix this severe hydrological issue, you have to change the physical location of the grounds from the surface to the deep subsurface. You must physically break the crust. Let's look closely at the cross-section of two different application methods to see the stark, unarguable contrast in water movement. On the left side, we have the common, internet-recommended method, a solid, half-inch layer of pure coffee grounds sitting undisturbed on top of the potting soil. When the heavy stream of water hits this specific layer, the cross-section reveals the stark, undeniable physical reality of the blockage. The water pools rapidly on top of the dark crust, frantically runs to the outer edges, and trickles uselessly down the inner plastic wall of the pot. The central mass of the soil, the exact location where the vital feeder roots live and drink, receives zero moisture. The microscopic pores in the soil below remain filled with air. The crust has sealed the soil off from the world above. On the right side, we have the mechanical correction that changes the hydrology. In this cross-section, the exact same volume of coffee grounds has been physically folded and aggressively mixed deep into the top 4 inches of the soil matrix using a hand trowel. The grounds are widely and evenly dispersed. The intensely fine, oily coffee particles are now physically separated from each other by much larger, coarser particles of sand, silt, expanded clay, and natural organic matter. By mechanically mixing the grounds deeply into the dirt, you destroy the continuous hydrophobic plane. The heavy oils are certainly still there on the individual particles, but they are physically isolated from one another. The incoming water can easily bypass the individual oily particles, traveling swiftly through the naturally hydrophilic soil channels created by the larger dirt grains. Furthermore, because the coffee grounds are now buried deep in the highly moist environment of the subsurface, they never have the opportunity to dry out. They remain consistently damp, meaning they never enter the severe locked hydrophobic phase. In this deeply hydrated state, microscopic soil bacteria and deep burrowing earthworms can rapidly access the individual coffee grounds, vigorously consuming and breaking down the carbon and nitrogen without ever compromising the critical physical hydrology of the pot. The biological interaction is vastly superior when the grounds are buried. Understanding the precise timeline of this crust formation is critical for successful container management, especially in the relentless heat of summer. In a sunny, warm environment with low humidity, a wet layer of coffee grounds can dehydrate and mechanically lock into a solid hydrophobic crust in under 48 hours. Environmental accelerators like heavy wind acting on the surface or high ambient temperatures speed up this evaporation process immensely, turning a wet sludge into a waterproof shield in record time. Once that rigid crust is fully formed and locked into place, it is structurally resilient. It will not dissolve or soften on its own when you attempt to water it. You cannot just spray it harder with a hose. The pressure will only blast the surrounding soil out of the pot. You have to take a heavy hand tool, like a metal cultivator or a stiff digging fork, and physically agitate the surface, aggressively breaking the surface tension and shattering the interlocking matrix of the grains. Mechanical, physical intervention is the only possible way to restore the water pathway. If you leave a continuous, unbroken layer of coffee grounds on the surface of your soil, you're effectively guaranteeing exactly 0 millimeters of water penetration during a standard, quick watering session. The water deflects away to the path of least resistance. The fragile roots below are cruelly forced to survive on whatever residual moisture was trapped deep in the pot before the crust fully formed, leading to rapid, unexplainable wilting and severe plant stress. You can and should use your leftover coffee grounds. They are a magnificent addition to the active soil food web of the garden, and they do not belong rotting in a plastic trash bag in a landfill. But you must respect the undeniable physics of fine, highly oily particulates. Never, under any circumstances, leave them exposed to the open air as a solid mulch. Always physically blend them deep into the existing soil structure with a trowel. By taking just 3 extra seconds to stir the grounds thoroughly into the dirt, you instantly transform a waterproof, suffocating seal into an active, biological ally, ensuring your roots actually get the water you're paying to give them. Go check the surface of your most stubborn potted plant. Is there a hard crust forming on top? Let me know what it looks like in the replies.